Hello, and welcome to Palisade Corporation's webcast, Lessons from Oil and Chemical Case Studies, How to Build Accurate and Decision-Focused At-Risk Models, presented by Huybert Groenendaal of EpiX Analytics. My name is Jameson Romeo Hall, and I will be your host today. And I'll be available to help answer technical questions by chat. Please note at this time, you are in a listen-only mode, and you're a part of a larger audience today. The attendee list is suppressed to maintain attendee privacy. We will be holding a Q&A session at the conclusion of today's presentation. You may ask an online question anytime throughout the presentation today by clicking on the Q&A panel. I would also encourage you to visit our website and sign up for a free trial download of our software, including our lead products, At-Risk, and the Decision Tools Suite. We invite you to sit back and relax and enjoy today's presentation. Huybert, you now have the presentation.
Thank you, Jameson, and good morning to everyone. Good morning, maybe good afternoon even, for people dialing in from Europe. I'm Huybert Groenendaal. I'm one of the managing partners at EpiX Analytics, and I'm excited to be presenting today to you. Let me say a few things about who we are before we get into the material today, just to give you a background on kind of where this webinar is coming from. So we're EpiX Analytics. We're a consultancy out of Boulder, Colorado. Just got about almost a 2-feet snowstorm here, so it's a good day for a webinar like this. Our goal here as a company is to help people make better decisions, and we do that through analytics. So analytics ranging from a lot of Monte Carlo, optimization, discrete event simulation, and a lot of other type of decision trees, etc. So obviously, at-risk is one of the tools we employ a lot. So for the next probably about half an hour, what I want to guide you through is lessons that we've had from 2 case studies. And as you can see in the title, they're both somewhat technical, and that's what the accurate stands for. So somewhat technical lessons, as well as for kind of less technical, more decision-focused lessons. So let's just get started. As Jameson said, by the way, any questions are certainly very welcome. This is the reason why we're trying to make this not too long, so we actually have some time for questions. So please let me know if there are any questions, and it'd be great to answer them at the end of the call today. Okay, so what are those two case studies? Well, the first case study is actually around partnerships. This is, without going into a lot of the details about this exact company, but it's a company that's selling in the chemical industry. They're selling a product, and what they're trying to understand better is what forming alternative relationship and alternative partnership can mean to their returns, but of course also to their risk. And we'll talk about kind of a lot of the technical details and some of the decision-focused questions, and we'll even get a quick look at the model. The second case study we'll be looking today is a different study. It's an optimization study. This is around picking an optimal portfolio. Now, I'm sure that some of you on the call have already maybe heard about that, have maybe even done this already. What this case study is kind of interesting in is that this company was actually already also using optimization, and they ran into some difficulty with the optimization tool. And so we'll talk about that. It's a little bit more technical, but I think it's going to be useful. Anyone that wants to or hopes to it sometime in the future do optimizations. Okay, so let's get started. We're going to talk through both of the case studies somewhat in a storytelling way. So we'll start in this case with the call of the company. So we got a call probably a year or so ago from a large multinational company asking in a kind of a short way, we currently sell things, we'd like to understand how we can make money, and we actually like to understand if alternative partnership agreements can help us make more money. Now, of course, that's a pretty critical question, and we started asking more and more. we'll talk about that in a bit. Of course, they also asked, can potentially, can we do some Monte Carlo on this? How can this help us? And always when we ask, when do you want this, they asked yesterday. So let's talk a little bit more about this, because of course this question is pretty broad. So this company essentially, it's a successful company. They've been in the business for a long time, and they have specific technology and expertise that allows them to essentially do R&D for other companies. So it's a business to business, and they sell product to other businesses. Where in the typical way they do kind of contract R&D, after which they will sell a product on a margin. So essentially, their partner will essentially reimburse them for their R&D if they hit certain successes, and after a certain product can be made, they will get a margin on those products if they're then going to be sold in the future. So essentially, it's a fairly low-risk business. They get paid for their R&D efforts, and then they get some kind of margin on their products. So far, this company hadn't actually used any type of Monte Carlo. They hadn't used that risk. They hadn't really had any expertise or any sort of experience looking really at risk. Of course, they looked at risk maybe more in a qualitative way, but certainly not in a quantitative way. So their general way of going for looking at if they should undertake a project like this and should form a partnership where they would perform some R&D and then they would sell products afterwards is through a regular Excel spreadsheet, no sort of Monte Carlo included. Okay, so they asked us, can you help us? And what we're trying to do here, and this is what kind of a first step here was, is we tried to actually find out what exactly they wanted. So the call went, and we had many. Oh, this is going one way too far. Okay, we had many follow-up calls to try and talk with management and with certain managers and so to understand what they really wanted to answer. And one of the things that we want to share here as a recommendation is that it's really important to have those conversations very, very early on. What we have here is actually a little bit of a graph. What we're trying to say here is that essentially the design of a model, the way that we're designing, in this case, a net risk model, or just in general a Monte Carlo model, when you have that many different risks, and we'll talk about the types of risks that are in here, that we uncovered through that initial phase, is that it's really important to really early understand what are the important risks, what are the things that are not so important, and really, I think one very important part is what do actually managers want to understand? What are really the questions that we want to have answered, want to answer through the modeling? So a really important advice, what I would want to give you on the call here is that develop some kind of a blueprint of the model. And a blueprint to really understand, to make sure that you sit down and wait with opening up your Excel spreadsheet and wait with opening at risk to really understand what are you going after, what is really the scope of what you're trying to answer before you open up the spreadsheet. We see that much too often that people just kind of immediately start looking at models and building models and so forth, and then they may not answer actually the question that they're trying to, that they really need to answer. You see here in this graph here that we try to explain it a little bit by saying, yes, we can, a big danger of kind of starting immediately with modeling is that the models get too complex. So as the size of the model or the amount of detail increases, we see that, maybe your perceived more accuracy, you certainly have more complexity, it takes more time and effort, and accuracy may go up a bit, but there's definitely a marginal decrease in how much more accuracy you can get. But one of the things that you'll see here is this transparency. That certainly will go down. So I mentioned already at the beginning of the call that this was a client that hadn't had a lot of experience yet with Monte Carlo, was new to it. So for them, it was really important that this model was going to make, kind of give them insight into risk around their investments. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit, but that it also became clear. And so transparency was really, really important, that this wasn't becoming a black box. Something to remember that, also a blueprint can help you with that. So let's talk a little bit more about what this model was going to do, and we'll see that in a bit as well. So here is in a kind of an encryptical way what kind of model, after this initial phase, we talked about with the client they would need. They would need a P&L model, profit or loss model, that would essentially look at profits and cash flows and so forth over the lifetime of products that they could develop, co-develop together with their partner in some kind of partnership agreement. So we'll start with some kind of R&D that has some kind of timeline to it. Then there will be a launch. But what was really kind of uncertain, and we're talking now a little bit more about the risk and the uncertainties, is these R&D costs, of course, we didn't know yet exactly how much that would be, and the R&D timeline was also pretty unknown. So depending on when we were able to launch the product, that would really determine kind of what competitive situation we may be at the product launch. And then, of course, in the commercial phase, we had lots of uncertainties around things like product pricing, market share, what actually sales volume would get, etc. That had all to do also with when we would launch this product, etc. So there were lots of different risk and uncertainty that were important. Now, I kind of referred to that a little bit, but of course, this client was interested in, they had their typical partnership arrangement where they would get paid for their R&D, and then they would get some margin from their product sales. What they wanted to understand is, what if we could maybe share some of this R&D costs, so we'll pay some for it, and then in return, we'll take a bigger slice for bigger margin, or we'll take some of the profits, for example. So in other words, what they wanted to do is see if they increase their risk a bit, what that could mean for their returns going forward. Okay, right. So kind of lots of risk, and then on top of that, we have different types of partnership arrangements, partnership agreements that could overlay on that and say, if we do this partnership agreement or this partnership agreement, how much return could we expect versus how much risk would we have? Okay, so you can kind of see already why this company started to kind of think, okay, maybe we need to better understand and quantify actually risk a bit. So one of the things that I'd like to highlight here a bit before I dive into the next slide is, okay, we talked a bit about how, for example, if the R&D timeline is longer, right, that would change maybe the competitive situation at product launch, and that would then also change what kind of pricing we may see. So let's say for example, that if we take more time for R&D, then the cost would probably be higher as well. And that would actually negatively affect the competitive situation. So in other words, it would be more competition, and therefore product pricing would be less. Maybe we have less of a market share, less pricing volume, so we have more cost, and then our commercial, where we start making money, is not as good either, right? So what I want to focus here on a little bit is relationships or correlations. So they were very important in this model, and I just kind of told you how, just kind of in normal words, right, why that is. There was really good reasons, and if I just pull back to that blueprint, that's one of the things we very quickly discovered that was really important. So what about correlations? So here we get in a little bit more technical part. What about these correlations? Well, they deserve great effort, and I actually put here what we see very often is that people forget about correlations, or they may kind of think of them as kind of a last-minute effort, right? You put your ranges in for maybe a per distribution or a triangular, where you say it's a low and medium and high, And then later on, like at the final end of the model, we think, oh, well, maybe these things are correlated or so forth. Let's talk a little bit more about these correlations, because one of the things is the case that omitting that we should include relationship and we don't include them in our risk models or any Monte Carlo models typically underestimates risk and can underestimate risk quite a bit. So if we go back to this model, you can see here that the relationship says if we have higher cost, then we also probably have lower cash flows. So in other words, you know, they're correlated in that they're making the situation even worse, right? So you can see how they're increasing the risk for the project because now we have, you know, say $2 million, twice the cost, and then we also don't have a lot of revenue, and so this is really a bad situation, right? So it's really correlations can really increase the risk of investments. Now the other way is true too, of course. If the R&D goes great, we can launch maybe sooner, and we have great sales. So you can see that final distribution, if you think about, for example, an NPV distribution, can become really wide because we can have some great situations, some bad situations. So I think that highlights kind of that typically not including relationship can underestimate the risk. All right. Now here is a point that may surprise some of you. It may not, but typically in the majority of the types of models and at-risk models that we make, we actually don't use rank order correlation. So you may think, how is that? Huh? What's he saying? So I think here I just kind of added an important rule to Monte Carlo that every iteration, so all of the 10,000 iteration, has to be a possible future scenario. And this is why we, of course, include these correlations so that we reflect those really bad cases and those really good cases. How do we do it then? What do we do? Because we say we put so much emphasis on these correlations, and then we say we don't put in rank order correlations. So what I want to highlight here, without going into the detail, but I'm giving you some links here you can look at just on the internet, is alternative methods, more, I would say, logical methods. Logical meaning you can kind of talk through it, methods of including relationships. And here you see some, and I'll actually, on the next slide, show you some in kind of picture form. So these are things like envelope method, lookup method, logical relationship. There's some more technical like the bootstrap or regression. But let's, for example, look at, for example, a very logical relationship. So if statements, end statements, and so forth. Those are really can be very, very powerful if we use them to reflect relationships in model. So I'm going to go back here to our model here, where we can say, for example, if this timeline is further than 2016 or 2018, then something happens and we actually use a different distribution maybe for our product pricing or our market share and so forth. So in other words, we really try to describe what would happen, not so much from is there a 0.8 correlation or a 0.7 or etc., but we're trying to describe that with logical relationship, right? So I'm going to show you here in the next slide. I'll do that in a bit. Kind of a picture of these different methods. But if you're interested in it, I would highly encourage you, just given the time of the webinar, I can't go through all of them, but have a look at those. VLOOKUPs and H lookups, for example, with these lookup tables can be really, really powerful. So I've already said kind of why we do it. Like I haven't actually explained yet why exactly we prefer those methods for rank order correlation. I've kind of inferred it, but let's go through two important reasons. So the first important reason is that these relationships can often much better mimic the type of thinking that the company or you may have about, as I said, if R&D goes over an extra year, then something can happen, right? So it's a much more logical relationship than for example, we have a big distribution of R&D expenses, a big distribution of for example, sales volume, and we put a big correlation between the two, right? That's a lot harder to do, or it's much more black box, so to speak, than putting in something logical. So from a model building perspective, kind of just going back, the multiple perspective, it's often much more, we can much better mimic it. I think also from the other side, if you're looking from a managerial perspective or a decision-making perspective, the way that these relationships work is often much easier to explain. So when we talked about black box a bit, these are much more clear in how these relationships work than trying to explain to a VP that we have used a 0.8 correlation or 0.9, and it's going to be a lot harder conversation at that point, because how do you defend a 0.8 or a 0.9? All right, so essentially the general recommendation is, I'm not saying that you should never use rank order correlation. We certainly do. But we typically try and think of, can we just mimic this through another more logical relationship that is a better proxy of what the risk really entails or what the relationship really entails. Okay. Here you see a link where you can actually, if you go just to this, you don't even have to register. You can just look on it online. We have this all online. And what you'll see in the slide before here, the M0146, or this code, you just type that into the search button, and you can actually see the envelope method with an risk model that tells you how to implement this, or actually has implemented it already. So you can just kind of look at that and search for yourself. Okay, so here's the link, and you could just go to EpiX Analytics and Model Assist, etc. And here's a little graphical representation of these different relationships. You'll see the same things in the models that are in Model Assist. So have a look, and hopefully this will help you kind of expand your toolbox of including relationships. Okay, so going back to the model, going back to the client, in fact, so I've told you a bit about the client, that they wanted to understand what could happen if they would actually take some more of the risk in terms of R&D, for example, and then because they take more risk, they would also get more reward. So here you see that graphically a bit. This is kind of part of the model even. Think about, for example, partnership one would be where they share some of the R&D costs. There's some different R&D costs, and the company would pay 50% of that. In return, they get 20% of the 200% margin on the product, but they don't get profit sharing. So this is kind of the least risky. Even if you make the zero, it'd be the least risky, but this is a not so risky partnership, right? I know if you think about, for example, partnership 4, the company would pay for all of the R&D. They would even give away maybe the product, but they would get 50% of the profit that the partner would get on that product. So this allowed them, and this is an input in that P&L model that we talked about before, this would allow them to actually evaluate different partnership for this R&D product, or this R&D project, yeah. So what would this result in? Well, here is kind of an example of what that insight was. So these are their projects, of course, and they wanted to see this from a financial perspective. They wanted to see also from other perspectives, but here we just looked at the financial perspective. So here's an example of a graph that this model would give them. And you see here that there's different agreements, and each agreement has a different NPV. Now, that's not a surprise. But what's really nice in this graph, this is actually just the net risk. We implemented this in Excel, but it's based on net risk functions and so forth. Where agreement 1 had a certain NPV, say it's 10 million, for example, in this made-up example, and then there's some risk around that, because they still have some risk in terms of how much they're going to sell, but there's really not that much risk to the company because all the R&D would be paid. Now, if you compare that, for example, to this arrangement, maybe this arrangement has a better expected NPV, so the expected value may be a bit higher, but you see they also have some risk. In fact, if you look at the zero line, the zero NPV, you see there's actually probability. This is the 90% confidence interval, by the way. There's maybe a 10 or 15% chance that the company would actually lose money, right? So it's a trade-off between maybe making more money and actually also having more risk. And this is really well displayed in a graph like this that we thought of even during the blueprint phase of the project, right? Because we really wanted to understand how management that had never really been exposed to to Monte Carlo could better understand these things without fancy graphs, with graphs that would be understandable to them. So I'm going to take a really brief look at the model. So here's a quick look at this model. I'm going to make it really short. You see here some tabs. There's some input tabs. There's some calculation tab. There's some results tab. What I'm going to focus mostly on is the results tab. Here we quickly see some inputs tabs. We even added some macros so that the client that hadn't had a lot of experience with that risk could just click and they would get the result. They would understand this result are used for budgeting, so they could look at what some of the more likely scenarios were, etc. There's a monthly forecast. There's a cash flow tab. Obviously, you need cash flows to understand the net present value and metrics around the net present value. And there's overall results tab. So what I was going to show you here is actually I'm going to run the model here. I'm just going to run it for, say, 500 iterations. That's not enough for final results, but enough for this webinar. And I was going to show you a little bit additional results that this model provides. So instead of just looking at net present value alone, we're also going to look at some other metrics that the client deemed really useful for decision-making purposes. Right. So you see here, this is the same graph. It's a different numbers, but that's okay. You see a similar type of graph. We also thought that it would be really interesting, or management found it really interesting to understand what's in the probability that they're actually going to lose money. In other words, what the probability the IRR is less than the discount rate, which, by the way, is the same as the probability NPV is less than 0. Right? So here we can kind of see that organized well for different partnership agreements. Here, if we go a little bit up, we see a little bit more detail around that NPV. For example, here's the eNPV. What's the probability less than 0? That's the same as the graph that you saw below. But here, for example, also your expected IRR, or maybe your expected payback period. There's a lot of different results that come out of a model like this, but these were kind of these summary results that the client found very useful to understand. Should they, first of all, pursue this project, but secondly, in what kind of partnership agreement, which would be the most attractive. Now you can see here, of course, they had the ability to change what kind of agreement they were evaluating, so they were able to do 5 at a time. They certainly can do more, but this was the way that they could quickly see what those agreements would be, what the results for the agreements would be. Okay, so going back to the model, if you have any questions, please note them, and we can talk about them at the end of the call. So the morale of this case study, I said it would be a bit of a combination of technical and non-technical things. So we can see here that risk can be really powerful to help senior management understand risk and reward pictures of partnership agreements. Here we talked about partnership agreement in some of the chemical industry. We certainly can also do that, or this can also be very applicable, of course, to, say, private equity, venture capital, joint ventures, just any kind of business development, really. We've also talked, sorry, went too far. We've also talked a little bit about the importance of blueprints, or if you don't call it a blueprint, at least making sure that before you start building models, that you sit down and really understand what's important and what's not important before you start overcomplicating models, and also make sure that they become decision focused, so that we don't have 100,000 or very lots of results that we may find interesting, but senior management is just going to be confused. Really, in fact, one of the challenges, I would say, is often limiting how much results you provide senior management, just to make sure they still understand the story, they still get that insight they need, but without overcomplicating, without overwhelming them, really. And then we talked about the importance of including relationship within a model and the different alternatives to rank order correlation. Okay. All right, so we're going to question number 2, case study number 2. This also was a large multinational company, and in this case, they actually had already a model. This was a company that had experience with Monte Carlo simulation, in fact, with Monte Carlo simulation combined with optimization. And so their call was, or their question essentially was, we have this large optimization model. That optimization model includes uncertainty. And the problem is that it's too slow. It actually takes us over 2 or 3 days to get results out of this model. And we'll talk a little bit why that is, and then we'll talk about some solutions here as well. Can you help us? That was our question. So, right, so this was an oil and gas company, and their optimization model was around drilling wells. So essentially, in a nutshell, they wanted a recipe or a list of projects that they would have to drill, but they had different constraints. They had constraints around their budget. So even though their budget was large, there was still more wells that they could drill than budget that they had. They also had some constraints around drilling equipment. So, you know, they just didn't have enough drilling equipment to drill everything. They had limited FTEs of certain characteristics. And they also had some wells that they could only drill in the winter. So there was only winter access. So how did they come up with the best recipe? Well, they, again, as I said, they had a large optimization model that included risk and uncertainty, Monte Carlo simulation, and it took over 2 days to run. So conceptually, without showing the exact client model, conceptually it looks very similar to this. So here is alternative projects, and they in fact had more than 200, quite a few. Each project has a certain cost. Think about your budget, right? So you know, these are kind of, you know, what it would cost. Number of FTEs, maybe different types of FTEs. FTEs in operations, maybe in R&D. This is just an example model, but you can imagine this. You can make it different types of FTEs that each project would require. And then there were some, you know, things about what they wanted, and they wanted, of course, a portfolio that would maximize their net present value or maximize the value to the company. And so here is kind of like in this example model. Again, this is not their model, but somewhat of a proxy of what their revenue would be. And as I said, it's a Monte Carlo model that the client had, so they had also some uncertainty in how much each well would provide in terms of oil or gas, and therefore, you know, what their net present value would actually be. They also had in their model this selection column, so to speak. So this is essentially what you call decision variables, or variables that would say, are we including this project or not, a 0 or a 1. So what we're asking at risk to do, at risk together with the risk optimizer, is which product should we include and which one should we not. And here were some of the constraints. You know, budget, maybe there's a 32,000, or in their case, many, many millions, budget constraint, and there are some constraints on how many FTEs the actual portfolio could have. Right, so let's talk really briefly about what Risk Optimizer actually does for you to understand why this would take so long. So first of all, it would start with running a Monte Carlo simulation of the model for a certain recipe, so for a certain portfolio of wells. Then it would say, does that recipe meet every constraint? Sometimes those steps would be at the same time. Then after it did a full Monte Carlo, it would check if the NPV, which would be objective of that optimization, is better than what we have seen before. So have we found essentially a better portfolio than we've ever found before? And if so, we would save it. We'd say, well, that's a great portfolio. If not, then it would, you know, select another portfolio and run a full Monte Carlo again. So this Monte Carlo, you see that we, for example, do a Monte Carlo with 1,000 iterations. We have to do many, many, many times. All right? So how many times? So imagine that, think about the spreadsheet I just showed you at 25 projects. How many different portfolios can we make out of that? Well, here's the number. I think it's 33 million and more. Yeah, 33.5 million. How about now if you have 50 projects? This is, by the way, 2 to the power 25, right? This is 2 to the power 50. Well, I'm not even going to pronounce this, and obviously with 200 projects, you know, the amount of portfolios we can create is really, really large, right? So it's very, it can take a long time, and this is the problem we were facing with 200 projects. There's a lot of different combinations you can put those projects together. So what are some solutions to get to a quicker solution faster, or get to an optimal solution faster? Well, obviously, if we have to do the Monte Carlo simulation every time, we can try and speed up the Monte Carlo simulations. We'll talk about that in a bit, but if we can take less time evaluating each portfolio, then we would be faster, right? We can also say, let's constrict the decision space. So in other words, if we, for example, say, well, a lot of these scenarios are just not feasible, they're never going to be the optimal portfolio, then that can also be a lot faster. And then we can also discretize the solution space. We'll talk about that in a little bit as well. But we really focused on these two. And so let's talk about them a bit more. So there's different kind of categories of things that we can do to make us find the optimal solution faster. Right? So speeding up the simulation time or the evaluation time, so we can make faster functions within Excel. We certainly went for that. We ran fewer iterations. It's certainly a trick that you can use as well. If you do an optimization, we typically don't call for 10,000 iterations. We may call for 1,000 or even less. And then once we get to a good solution, we may increase our iterations to look very specifically in a certain region. One surprising thing that a lot of people find surprising is that less formatting in your Excel spreadsheet can actually really increase the speed of your Excel and thus your Monte Carlo and therefore the optimization. And actually, in fact, graphs and all these things that really are not part of the optimization, take them out. If speed becomes an issue with optimization models, minimize the model, take everything that's not part of that optimization out of it, and it can really help. So we certainly went for all of these. This didn't give us the win. It was some easy wins, I guess. This certainly didn't get us to a speed that was acceptable to us nor to the client. What we found actually, and this is a bit more advanced but certainly worth talking about, is that when you think about Monte Carlo simulation, what we're really doing is we're approximating something that is too hard to calculate. So if you think about that really briefly, when I ask everyone on this call, what is the probability that if I toss a coin 5 times, what's the probability that 5 times in a row it would be a head? I think most of the call would probably be saying, well, that's a half times a half times a half times a half times a half. And that's 1 out of, I think, 64, if I just do it in my head. So no Monte Carlo needed there, right? We still did a probability calculation. We still got to a probability that we wanted. So sometimes in certain situations, and this was one of them, we can actually use probability calculation. And in this case, that was the case. So what we did is use something called central limit theorem, which essentially has to do with the normal distribution and has to do with the fact that what we're doing here is we're looking at individual oil wells and we're adding together the net present values of each of these oil wells. And when you're adding lots of different distributions together, something interesting happens, and which is called central limit theorem. And so we were able to use that, and therefore actually, that is part of the speeding up of the evaluation time. We replaced the whole Monte Carlo piece of it, like they're running 10,000 or 5,000 iterations. We were able to replace that with probability calculations. And so, in other words, we were able to very quickly get to a P10 and a P90, but just by a calculation and the mean and so forth, right? So, in other words, that really sped things up. All right. Let's talk about some other constraints here. So, just to wrap this up. So often, this is not all the time available. You can't always do this, but these things can really help you still. And I would not underestimate what, for example, less formatting does, or not including things that are not necessarily for the optimization. So we talked about constraining that decision space a little bit, and I wanted to actually show you that in the model. So let me go to the model here. Let me show you how that could look like and how actually intuitive that is, what we mean with that. So here you see that same optimization model, that example that I said here. I've also said that 2 to the power 25, right, is how many situations. So this was already 33 million different ways we can structure this. So what can we do, for example, here, if we wanted to find the portfolio that has the maximum, in this case, revenues or benefits, right? So we want to maximize this thing. Well, one simple thing would be to say, okay, we have a maximum budget, say, of $32 million. Every additional project here has positive revenues, right? So in other words, why would we ever look at a budget that is, say, less than 25 million or 25,000, I should say, right? If we have the model kind of spend time in that area, then we're spoiling our time, right? So let me just kind of quickly show you that. Here we open up Risk Optimizer in the model definitions, and I just kind of want to quickly show you how easy that is. You see here we have that budget, right? That is between the budget, this number, that S, what we actually use in the model, is less than the 32,500, right? What we can just do is, instead of that 0, we can, for example, put in, ideally we put that into this spreadsheet, but we can put in here, for example, that there's no way we're going to find the optimal portfolio for less than 25,000. Right? So here we just add the 25,000. Now we have constrained that decision space quite a bit. And this can also really help make sure that the model's looking in the right place, that we're not spoiling time looking elsewhere. Okay, just wanted to show you a quick trick there that can also help. Right. Okay, one other thing in terms of speeding up optimization models is that it often can also help start the model really close to an optimal solution. And it's pretty obvious, but if we combine all of these things, it can really help speed things up. Okay, so this was a bit shorter, a bit more technical, but in case the morale of case study 2 was that this really helped this client. In fact, if I start with that benefit to the client, this model actually went from more than 2 days to less than 5 minutes. In fact, I think it was closer to 1 minute, where that optimization would just find the optimal solution really quick. And in fact, the model not only found it quicker, but also had found some better solution, or in fact, the best solution that the model before that wasn't able to find. We talked here about drilling, but we certainly can, optimization can, of course, be done in many, many different areas. Optimal hiring decisions, inventory, blending, etc. So there are lots more application than just the drilling. Okay. We're 45 minutes in, so the lessons of the 2 case studies is both for partnership agreements as well as for optimal project portfolio. At risk can be really, really powerful to really help senior management understand risk, as we saw on the first time, or find optimal portfolios. Does this, by the way, mean that optimal portfolio is always the one that senior management should go for? I should certainly would argue no. It's just a really powerful way of showing to management how can a portfolio be optimized further. It doesn't mean that the model always includes every strategic aspect. There may be things that are not quantified in the model that could tell management to go for other portfolios. But it certainly can help, for example, make management understand how much money is laid on the table, is left on the table. And we talked about some technical lessons, important blueprints, or if you think blueprints, just kind of make sure that the models really answer questions, the questions that are needed, and are not overly complex. We talked about the relationships, and we talked about various approaches to building, I would say, useful but really usable optimization models that give us solutions in an acceptable time. Thank you. I hope that there are some questions. I hope that you enjoyed the call today, and look forward to any questions. Jameson.
Yes, thank you, Huybert. Yeah, let's wait. That was great. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Let's wait a minute or two, see if any questions come in. It was very succinct and clear. I mean, we really appreciate that, especially from the recording archive point of view, too.
You're very welcome.
And yes, if you're watching this recording in the future, please feel free to reach out to us too. Let's see. Sometimes you answer all the questions that come up in the webcast. I mean, this may be one of yes, this may be one of those situations. We'll wait another moment or two to see if any come in. Oh my goodness, I don't see any yet. Let me check my panel just to confirm. Ah, good. Here comes some. How other internal controls, such as inventories, as you mentioned, could help the calculations?
Could you repeat that, James?
Yes. How other internal controls, such as inventories, as you mentioned, could help over the calculations?
I'm not sure if I totally follow that.
No, I'm not sure I do. But maybe we can email us both,
so
and we can elaborate.
Are there maybe other controls within the risk solver that can help us get quicker to optimization?
I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I'll explore further.
Okay.
Could you go back to the slide where we can see how we can find correlation models?
Absolutely. Yeah. Now, would this slide actually be also the slide deck would also be available for people to download? Or?
Oh, good. Yeah, if you could send that to me, that'd be great. I'll send that along.
Right.
Yeah, perfect.
Great. So, and again, just for people on the call, this model assist is you can just browse it with your browser on the internet. It's an open, essentially it's an open encyclopedia of techniques within risk analysis, and with probably over 100 different at-risk models included. So
that's really neat.
You can not only read about it, you can actually also see how to include it. So.
This is a great resource. Let's see. We have some kudos here. And then, another question. Do you use any reference material for defining a certain distribution for a certain variable? For example, capital cost, or is it experience-based?
It's a great question. So how do we select distributions, and why would we use certain ones? Well, it's another webinar for sure, but I would say there's actually there's different categories of distributions. There are obviously the clear ones like discrete versus non-discrete or continuous distributions, but there are also in terms of there's certain distributions that are actually really kind of designed and made for expert opinion, where there are certain distributions that actually represent certain processes. So let me take an example. The PERT, I think most of you on the call are familiar with the PERT and the triangular. There are two distributions that are really having, they're made for one purpose really, which is expert opinion. So do we tend to use those a lot? Yes. Certainly when you talk about cost estimates, time estimates and so forth, or even revenue, when you think about the minimum, maybe most likely max, those are two very common distributions. But then there are also distributions like, for example, the binomial or the Poisson, and that actually have a certain stochastic process behind them. So in other words, like, for example, the binomial, which is a pretty simple one, kind of says the process of there's a probability and there is a chance for a 0 or a 1, or what we call failure or success. So they tend to be used a lot when you have certain failure or success. You can have that with R&D. You can have it when you have to redo something in an R&D world, or when you find oil or not, or something like that. A Poisson has another story behind it, for example, where there's a certain process where events happen over time. So if I kind of go back to the question, yes, there's certainly reasons to using certain distributions. It also depends, I would say, on if you have data. If you have data, of course, you have the ability sometimes to fit distributions to data. But I would say that it certainly can be very powerful to understand, at least for the most common, 5 to 10 distributions, a bit of the reasoning for their existence, kind of what I could call the story behind them, because it will really kind of help you understand, okay, well, if I see this out there, I kind of understand that that must be a Poisson distribution, or it could be following some kind of Poisson process, or this is clearly a purge because we're talking expert opinion. And certainly, I guess to round that off, maybe you see here, for example, we had included that as actually a page which is pretty often visited. Obviously, is around selecting the appropriate distribution for your model.
Mm-hmm.
That gives links to every single distribution as well, but it talks a little bit more about what I just talked about, except in a further detail.
Great. Oh, we have one more question, and then that maybe that'll be it. Oh, could you go back to the page with the correlation model numbers?
Yep.
Yeah. Great, and that was kudos on that answer. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, maybe if no more questions, we should let you go. But I want to say that if any more questions occur to you, please feel free to reach out to us.
Thank you all for being on the call today. Hope you have a good day, and hope you find the webinar today useful.
I think we have. Hey, thank you so much, Huybert. Yeah, we really appreciate this.
You're very welcome. Enjoy the day.
Yes, you too.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everybody.